This is the Surefire Delta. It's discontinued, so the main purpose of this commentary is mainly going to be explore proof or utility of concept, because you actually can't get this knife except on the secondary market. It's not overly common, and the price is probably going to be a bit high. But as I said, as a concept, it's kind of interesting. So the first thing I'll say is, from a perspective, the way that I looked at this might be a bit different. I looked at this as a multi-tool which focused on being a knife first. So here's a very decent multi-tool. This is a Leatherman super tool. This is a multi-tool which more or less has a knife as an afterthought. It does have a knife blade on it. Very awkward to get to use, not very ergonomic at all. Even the worst kind of handle on a folding knife you can think on, it'd probably be a bit better than this. And as you can see, it's not that easy to take out, put away. Some later tools got the idea, which is relatively decent, of putting the blade on the outside of the handle so that you can access and use it without having to open up the tool. But even then, if you look at it, the handle obviously isn't made, again, for long-term use. It's not ergonomic, it's not comfortable, it's not secure. And again, even the worst kind of folding knife you can think on is probably going to look a lot better than this in terms of ergonomics and security. But so again, the way I would look at this is it's a multi-tool which focuses on being a knife first and has the other issues secondary. From that point of view, I found it rather useful in an urban setting. When you're in and around town, when you're working on construction sites, or you're having to salvage and utilize materials such as metals and work on tools, it can be kind of interesting. It has a little wire breaker up here which can be useful to cut, bend and manipulate smaller wires and nails. It has basically a fixed and variable socket head in here that you can use as a rather awkward but still functional wrench. The flipper is actually nicely tapered for a flathead screwdriver, and it has a little slitter back here. These tools in general don't get in the way of the knife for lighter use. I could work on this 20 to 40 pounds on cuts, no real issue. However, when you move out of an urban environment, move to a more rural environment where you're doing more woodworking and just more focused cutting of the knife, heavier ropes, heavier cardboard, heavier woods, and just harder utility work, I was doing some sod skinning for a while, you start putting more force into the handle and all these speed holes start to become a problem. And in that type of environment, all these little things don't tend to have that much application. When you're out in the woods, how often do you actually use a flathead screwdriver? How often do you use this little seatbelt cutter? Not very often. So in that type of environment, I'd simply take a knife like this. This is a Pretium from Elliott Williamson. Much more ergonomic, much more secure, much more stable in hand, and it's simply a better knife. It doesn't have the other features, but again, in a rural environment, I never really found the use for them. But in an urban environment, putting the Pretium against the Delta, I did appreciate at times having the little features on the Delta, and when I wasn't doing extended or very heavy cutting, the ergonomic issues on this weren't a bit of a drawback. Now the other question is, well, how does it do just as a knife? Well, to preface this is a very biased perspective because this blade has been extensively reground. Mike Gavco, the original owner, flattened this grind and left a very tiny secondary edge bevel, and I thinned it out even more than that. So the cutting performance, the durability, the edge retention, the ease of sharpening, and ease of maintenance is all much higher with the reground profile. So as stock, you're not going to get that. But looking at this, it has a very nice, very clean utilitarian blade shape, similar to other decent utility styles. Now these are not identical, but you can see this is a very well used original paramilitary, very clean blade shape. Similar shape on the Delta, and even if I take a knife which looks to be very different, this is Victorious from CKC Knives, the same very simple, very clean utility type pattern with Kylie's patented fish scaler option. Now the main benefit of using this knife as opposed to something like this from Great Eastern Cutlery, which is very nice classical design, is of course the blade is much more narrow and much thinner, so it greatly enhances the cutting ability and general utility for lighter cutting, but you'd snap this rather trivially in prying. Now the difficulty with that type of work is, okay, another example, Spyderco Delica in Super Blue, you can see full distal taper to a very thin tip. So you say, okay, fine, you carry the Surefire Delta and it's much stronger. But how much stronger? You can still break it, right? Yeah, you can. But there are things that I can do with this that I wouldn't be able to do with the Spyderco Delica. Again, because of the relatively thin tip. So for example, on heavy cardboard packaging with really heavy staples, I could possibly break the tip off this. It's not something that I'd want to experiment on, except for the sake of experimenting. This tip is much thicker and absolutely laughs at that. I can pop drywall off over screws. I can even pop strapping off over 2.5-inch nails. Now, would I pry an actual piece of 2x4 off a wall? Would I pry a lock off a door with this? No. But you can clearly see that there are a large realm of where the prying ability of this does come into play. And as well, even when you move outside to a more rural setting, this actually has a bit of a decent snap chopping power. So you can limb off smaller sticks with this, and you simply can't with something like the Spyderco Delica, and you definitely can't with the Great Eastern. It's simply a push cutter. So there's a benefit for me to carrying a heavier blade, but again, in a basic rural setting, Pretium wins directly. It's simply a much better knife. So after about 6 months of using this, it is kind of interesting, and most of the people that I give it to come to the same general conclusions. People who are just basically what I would call woods type people who do fishing and hunting and camping, don't really have much of a use for it. See it as a bit of a gimmick and would simply prefer a cleaner design, something like your paramilitary as a basic choice. However, people working in a more urban environment, people who do basically handyman type jobs, carpenters and that kind of stuff, who carry a knife on them and don't want to maybe go with a full multi-tool, but just have a knife blade with some extra features, tend to appreciate this. Now of course, in terms of a value, as a function of cost, this was relatively expensive, and very few people would argue that it's worth it in terms of price. But again, from a proof or interesting point of concept, I think it's relatively interesting. As a remark about the steel, this is S30V. Lots has been said about this. The only thing I will say is that the steel in this is seriously defective. Now I don't know exactly what's causing it, but it has to be a combination of the way it was thermally processed by the manufacturer, Surefire, possibly some effect to the fact that it had a significant acid wash, because this consistently gets damaged very easily. And I've compared it side by side to many other knives in many different steels. The sod cutting that I did, I used 01, I used AUS 8, I used M4, VG10, S125V, and this would consistently get damaged out of all those steels. Now yes, you can make an argument that 01 at a similar hardness would be more durable, but there's no way S125V should be more durable, but it was. And this would even get damaged relatively readily when I was doing some light chopping on alder, and alder's a very soft wood. It's comparable to, say, clear white pine, which is essentially a step only above balsa. And you don't want to rush into judgments on this, because of course you could be out chopping, look at the blade and see a little nick in it, but it could be because the wood was dirty. It could be because you cut something and hit a staple a day earlier and didn't see it right away. But consistently, I would check this, and over again, I would find that the edge was getting prematurely damaged. Even how it responded to sharpening was the same way. The edge wouldn't tend to form clean off the stones, it tended to fracture. So if you looked at it under magnification, you'd see the grind lines going up to the edge, and then the edge wouldn't form as those grind lines were cut, but it would form worse than that. You would actually see a more irregular edge, so it was actually fracturing. The initial edge retention was quite low. It was comparable to, say, one of the more inexpensive kitchen knives that you would buy for around $5. After literally dozens of sharpening sessions where I used the knife significantly, ground away a lot of steel, reset the edge, at best it improved to the level where it's up to around where VG10 is. An S30V should be a little bit beyond that. Not tremendously, but it should be significantly beyond that, and it isn't. It basically maximized at that level. So again, there is some issues with this, and it is fracturing in this one sample. No idea if all the Surefire Deltas were like that. So after about a 6-month perspective on this, yeah, it does appear to be a bit gimmicky. Anyone as a hunter, fisherman, camper, a type of outdoorsman is probably going to regard it just as a bit gimmicky. But in an urban setting, I think it makes some interesting points about utility of a multi-tool which is blade oriented or centered versus a multi-tool which is basically plier centered. So I think there are some interesting concepts there. I don't think this was 100% successful in their implementation, but I think it's kind of a curious design, and most of the aspects of it are very well done. And it doesn't have a lot of the problems that you see on many knives. The thumb ramp is very well, you can see how it naturally fits the indexing or positioning of the thumb. Very clean blade design. Decent handle implementation, everything is well rounded, so they did a lot of things right. So overall, interesting knife, really enjoyed using it. I'm going to give this now an extended pass around to some of my friends and just see how it holds up in use. And if the blade ever does turn around and start acting like S30V should, I'll probably do an update to this sometime in the future after about another year or so.